And good evening, everybody. Welcome once again to We Are the Builders Australia with my co-host Helen Woolley, a close comrade and friend of mine as well. How are you doing tonight, Helen?
Yeah, very good, very good, very good. I'm fortunate to be sitting in a motel room tonight, which is very comfortable.
Oh well, could be elsewhere. Could be worse elsewhere. But be that for those of you that may be tuning in, or those of you overseas, we're now in a 5-day lockdown. The super spreader is amongst Victoria, so the government has thrown everything. Well, the government's had to put a 5-day lockdown in, and until the middle of the night on Tuesday night. So, but before we continue on, also too, I'd like to acknowledge the lands. Well, I'm actually televising from here from the lands of the Jar Jar Wrong, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and future, and recognise that their struggle, the anti-colonial struggle, was part of a broader class struggle. Now the class struggle is against imperialism as such, so their struggle is part of our struggle. Black and white unite. We need to be united and organised to eventually change this system from imperialism to socialism. And I'm not too familiar with the lands of the Gippsland area, but obviously understand that we actually pay our respects to all those people from past, present, and future. Well, just an oversight, we from the last from the last live study, we actually discussed how socialism developed and also how capitalism developed into imperialism. And obviously, you could see that there was some, the dialectical and historical materialism in practice here, how everything came from a lower stage of development to a higher stage, etc. And it's interesting how the concept of how socialism first came into being. It wasn't Marx, it wasn't Engels, and such. It was many others that came on this utopian view of socialism. But what Marx and Engels did was actually made it into a science and gave us a blueprint to work from, even though it was in an era when capitalism was still developing and coming into being. It still gave us the initial blueprint to work from. And then Lenin obviously developed it further when capitalism went into imperialism. And now, as we live under an imperialist system, otherwise known as was it free trade? Well, such as free trade. You have organisations, World Trade Organisation, International Finance, etc. They're the ones who actually run the show. So, is there anything you want to add on to that?
Just on this question of imperialism, it was very interesting. I did an interview with the ambassador. He's a representative in Canberra from Venezuela. And he was explaining how no transaction that we make in our system, no transaction that we make, every transaction that we make goes through the United States. And that's imperialism. It goes through the major banking cartels based in Wall Street and London. So every MasterCard charge that we make, every Visa, all of our banks here in Australia are connected directly to the major banking cartels in London. And that was really significant in thinking that, to know that every single day life for not just for governments, but for the ordinary people, every single transaction that we make goes through these major banking cartels. And I think that's very important, because that brings home the fact that imperialism is not a government system. It's not about the government. It's about an international banking system. And that's what imperialism is. It's a finance system. And I think that for me really brought it home, just how much we're all part of the system.
Exactly, and I think that's what we've got to keep that always in the mind. That imperialism is not a government policy; it is the system. This is capitalism now at its highest stage. What we have now, what we see is what we call free trade agreements. Actually, best entitled low-wage police state agreements. And we've seen this all around the world, and what we're seeing is all the extraction, all the mineral wealth. Australia is no different from a lot of other countries. We're seeing all that mineral wealth. It's like a big vacuum cleaner being imposed on us and sucking all that mineral wealth up into the hands of the very few. And when what they talked about the export of capital, what it means is not throwing money around the planet. What it actually means is actually capital. It means basically the means of production. It means the resources, etc. That is actually exported around the world and involved to make further super profits. And we're seeing, and then what basic imperialism does require now in this day is the rest of the world is poor, while the very few, such as the Wall Street, such as London Stock Exchange, and banks, etc., and all the oil cartels or oil bankers are exclusively very rich, and the rest of the rest of the world is doing poor. So we're seeing this in practice today.
Yeah, definitely.
So, well, today we're on parts 1.1.8 of The Party of a New Type, and that's out of Caleb Maupin's book, We Are the City Builders, the Centre of Political Innovation Educational Manual. And I'd also like to announce as well, the Centre of Political Innovation the website is now up. Just it's I think just Google it. You can go cpiusa.org.au, I think it is. But you can actually just Google it and it'll come on up. So that's up and running now. And I believe they had their first conference not so long ago at a getaway in Pennsylvania there. So well done to everyone in the Centre of Political Innovation to kick that all off. So it's up and running in the US, and I have to take my hat off, not just to Caleb, but all the others there as well. They're doing some excellent work there. So what we'll do, we'll obviously read paragraphs. Did you want to kick this one off?
Yeah. I don't mind doing that. So last week we also talked about that the ruling class and the people that kind of thought that maybe socialism was a bit dead. They called it the crisis of Marxism, and that they thought that it could be reformed somehow, and that Marxism wasn't really the way forward. Mm-hmm. But what happened there then was, of course, we started to go into World War One, and upon that kind of condition, there was the need for a new party. And so that's kind of where we're at now. So this is entitled The Party of a New Type. The ultimate conclusion of the crisis of Marxism was millions of workers were sent to their death in the First World War. The Western imperialists battled each other for control of the world. With the British and Americans blocking the rise of their rivals in Germany and Austria, the result was mass killing as never seen before. So what had previously happened was that the international socialist movement had said, we will not send workers off to war for imperialist gain and for imperialist war. But then some countries turned their back on that ideal and said, no, we need to fight for the fatherland because that will weaken the country, or whatever their excuses were. I don't want to get into that side of things. But had the socialists, had the communist movement around the world stuck to their guns and said, we will not send workers off to war in an imperialist war, then this whole situation wouldn't have arisen. We wouldn't have seen mass amounts of people going off to die in imperialist war.
And actually, just to add something for everyone viewing that will eventually watch this in the future, I will highly recommend The History of the Three Internationals by William Z. Foster. William Z. Foster gets right into the detail about that, about what happened. Lenin does as well, about the collapse of the Second International, and I recommend reading that. But yeah, The History of the Three Internationals is perfect. And I think even for Australia, and I no doubt for New Zealand as well, we were just as equally caught up in that. Actually interesting, Labor parties, actually initially supported it, and they actually caused a split within the Labor parties for about 3 years within the World War One, and obviously about the anti-conscription, the role of the IWW, the International Industrial Workers of the World, and many other progressive and socialist-minded people at the time were leading the charge to, no, we're not going to cooperate with this war no more. And also on the Western Front as well, where the first Anzac Day was formed on the Somme, there was actually a sign of silent rebellion, a silent protest. We've been used as cannon fodder for British imperialism, and remembering those who died for what. Exactly, it wasn't freedom. So they paid the supreme sacrifice, but for what? And I think we've always got to keep that in the back of our minds as well.
Yeah, definitely. So blame for this horrendous catastrophe of destruction and death could not simply be placed on capitalism, but on the bankruptcy of the massive socialist movement that could have stopped the war. And that's a key. That's kind of what I was saying in that first part there. Had the socialist movement stuck together and said, no, we're not going to send workers off to war to fight for imperialism, then the situation would not have occurred. The various parties of the Second International had spoken of class solidarity, but when the guns of August roared in 1914, they abandoned their internationalist principles and sent their rank and file off to die. Lenin was a Russian revolutionary who lived in exile, and from Britain he observed that the stratification of the working class in Western countries was shifting the revolutionary energy to the countries of the East. Like a voice crying out in the wilderness, he had warned Marxists around the world about the decline of social democracy. Lenin explained how capitalism was now in its monopoly stage of imperialism. Marxists had opposed all nationalism, but Lenin argued that it was national liberation and the struggle of countries across the world to break free from imperialist financial order that would give birth to socialism. While Marx's manifesto had ended with a reference to Germany, and most Marxists believed that the communist revolution would break out in Western developed countries, Lenin said the opposite. Lenin said the revolutionary upsurge in the 20th century would take place in the East and in the colonized world. As Western capitalists kept countries in a chronic poverty as captive markets and spheres of influence, they would be forced to adopt socialism in order to break free. The Marxists of the Third World would sit at the center of the united front against imperialism as whole nations fought to be free. Is that true of today, do you think? Dave,
Yeah, I think it's still quite some relevance for us today. I mean, we're obviously basically as Western company, that's what it is. They're actually keeping the rest of the world poor, but what we're seeing is a lot also the struggle of what they call the third world, what we call the developing world now. Exactly, and it obviously they've been given the leg up by China now with the Belt and Road Initiative. They've realised, well, there is an alternative now we can hook onto, an anti-imperialist one, that we can develop our economies further without having to be kept in destitution and poverty.
And I think it's a very accurate analysis. In fact, we've yet to see our socialist revolution or a revolution in any of the developed world as such, and yet revolution is occurring around the world. And of course Latin America and Central America is the hotspot of revolution at the moment. So from exile, Lenin pitched his vision of a new revolutionary organization to seize control of Russia. He called it a party of a new type, and what eventually became of it was known to the world as Bolshevism. The Bolshevik movement, despite espousing a strictly materialist and Marxist perspective, carried with it many features of Russia's cultural and spiritual past. With his groundbreaking work, What Is to Be Done, Vladimir Lenin rejected the liberal democratic model for political parties. The vanguard organization Lenin created was a kind of secret society made up of those who gave up their whole lives to be the tribune of the people. Instead of putting forward a Marxist program, the party engaged in agitation, stirring up the masses to greater confrontation while reserving ideology propaganda for the advanced and recruitable.
The Bolshevik movement was founded in exile by Russian intellectuals and middle-class radicals. They sought to mobilize the industrial working class to topple the Tsarist autocracy and replace it with a socialist-orientated state. Like Rosa Luxemburg, Eugene Debs, and others, the Bolsheviks opposed the First World War. They denounced the various socialist parties that supported the imperialist bloodbath. Lenin described the Second International and its member parties as a stinking corpse, and rightfully so. The name Bolshevik literally means majority group. The name was selected after the majority of those who met with Lenin in 1903 agreed to form his party of a new type. The minority of those in the room, in brackets Mensheviks, rejected the plan. However, most of the people who eventually fought in the streets to bring the Bolsheviks to power were probably not aware of this meeting and the origins of the name. To the average Russian worker, Bolshevism essentially came across as majorityism. Long word. The Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, Bolshevik, in their call for a revolutionary dictatorship of workers and peasants, fought for the majority of Russia's people against the minority of wealthy factory owners, landlords, and the Tsarist autocracy. After the Tsar stepped down following Russia's February Revolution in 1917, Lenin returned from exile to seize the moment. It is widely understood that in order to return to the country, Lenin received some level of support from German intelligence agencies who wanted to see Russia withdraw from the war. Lenin travelled to Russia on a sealed train so his arrival would not be anticipated. When Lenin arrived, he presented his famous April thesis, reorientating the Bolsheviks to be dedicated to ending the war and defending the Soviets or councils the people had formed during the uprising. Lenin instructed his political organisation to change their name. Instead of calling themselves Social Democrats, the Bolsheviks organisation adopted the label of Communist in order to distinguish themselves from the failed Marxist movement in Europe. I'll continue on disclosure. The platform of the Bolshevik Party included many planks, such as the nationalisation of banks, the separation of church and state, and granting women the right to vote. However, the slogan for which the Bolsheviks were known as peace, land, and bread. Hang on for a minute. Some unnamed diet water. The Bolshevik entered an alliance with the Russian capitalists, who were tied in with German capital. The Bolsheviks continued to lead strikes, demanding an end to the war. The Bolsheviks defended the continued existence of the Soviets, which evolved into a kind of dual government structure in Russia's urban centres. In September of 1917, the Bolsheviks repelled the Kornilov reaction and prevented a military regime from taking power in St. Petersburg, which would have aggressively continued the war. In October 1917, Lenin's party of a new type seized power on a platform of all power to the Soviets and created a new government. Soviet Russia eventually became the Soviet Union, granting autonomy to the various nationalities that had kept part of the Russian Empire. That had been part of the Russian Empire. Following the Russian Revolution, various uprisings took place across Europe. As the First World War ended, German soldiers rose up against the Kaiser. Hungarian workers took up arms and seized government buildings. This explosion of revolutionary anger as a horrific war was ending shook the world, but only in Russia were the revolutionaries able to keep power.
The Bolsheviks withstood invasion by 15 different countries and fought a lengthy civil war to maintain their Soviet government. The Russian people starved and suffered amid an economic blockade and massive internal turmoil. Originally, the Soviet government had maintained three major political parties: the Bolsheviks, the left Mensheviks, and the left Socialist Revolutionaries, all of which recognized the Soviet constitution and held seats in government. However, as the blockade and internal turmoil escalated, both the left Mensheviks and the left socialist revolutionaries launched armed revolts against the Bolsheviks. A member of the left Socialist Revolutionary Party even shot Lenin, severely wounding him. As a result of these conditions, the Soviet government was forced to become more authoritarian, and all other political parties were outlawed. Openness and civil freedoms are based on a level of stability and development, but a society under siege is forced to become rigid and militarized. Soon, even factions within the Bolshevik Party were no longer permitted. Ironclad discipline was needed in order to hold the country together in the face of relentless efforts to crush socialism. After Lenin's death in 1924, Leon Trotsky and his followers among the Bolsheviks held on to the illusion that Europe's factory workers would soon rise up. Describing his theory of permanent revolution, Trotsky wrote, "The completion of the socialist revolution within national limits is unthinkable. One of the basic reasons for the crisis in bourgeois society is the fact that the productive forces created by it can no longer be reconciled within the framework of the national state. The socialist revolution begins in the national arena, it unfolds on the international arena, and it is completed on the world arena. Thus, the socialist revolution becomes a permanent revolution in a newer and broader sense of the word. It attains completion only in the final victory of the new society of the entire planet." However, among a population that was weary of war and chaos, this call for marching into Europe in a crusade to behead every last king and capitalist fell on deaf ears. Joseph Stalin, a Georgian Bolshevik organizer who had grown up in poverty, took the helm of the Soviet government. His platform was of building socialism in one country, rejecting Trotsky's bloodthirsty fantasy of permanent revolution. Under Stalin's leadership, the Soviet government signed treaties with the Western countries and focused on raising living standards. And at this point, David, just want to draw parallels here with really how it's always occurred in revolutionary countries. There's always been this massive kind of upsurge of development, and then there seems to be a series of consolidating that massive buildup of progressive things that initially took place in the early days of the revolution, and then there seems to be a period where there's a need, because of the blockades that are always imposed by imperialism on socialist countries. There's a period where the country has to consolidate all of those things and may have to make concessions also to Western or to the imperialist powers. And so, in the case of the Soviet government, they made treaties so that they could develop. Venezuela has created a free economic zone where they can, encourage business to invest in that economic zone. Cuba had to open its doors to tourism. China has opened its doors to allowing investment in its countries and so on. People on the left consider all of these things to be unprogressive things to do, and it seems to herald for the left in the developed world. We think that, oh my God, they're going backwards, they're going to the left, they're going more to the right, they're going back to capitalism. It's not really the case. It's a case of that you have to work with the conditions that you live in, and the blockades that imperialism poses on socialist countries makes it very difficult for the development of those countries to continue on an upward trend constantly.
And actually, what's interesting, your point about blockading socialist countries, Cuba is a classic example, case in point. Now, we just saw what happened on the weekend about the so-called large protests. Well, they actually weren't very large protests, or you're lucky to even get like a few thousand. The millions of people that march in Cuba on May Day support the policies of the Cuban government. They said love their country in Cuba. The problem we've got is the draconian US blockade on Cuba, which hinders their growth, which the US imperialists are trying to hinder their growth even further and develop their economy further. And in fact, it is draconian, and I don't say that very lightly either. That's a classic case in point. And the amount of interference we see in these countries that try to hinder them, to make them fail. It's interesting, you pointed out, you actually read about when the Bolsheviks, along with the others, seized power back in 1917. Now, the Soviet government, the young Soviet government, wasn't just the communists, it was all these other groups. But some of these groups went and attacked the communists and caused this instability. Now, when probably might be in the questions when we get around to about the authoritarianism around it and etc. But the reason why they had to do it, because they'd just been through a civil war. They had stability. They were surrounded by very hostile countries and hostile forces internally. They had the situation was pretty. It was just hanging on a shoestring, really, or on a piece of string. So they had to be something right for this to be successful. This is how it's going to be, and even too now moving forward. A little bit to the 2 years, and Trotsky was going on about this permanent revolution. Now, actually, myself and two of the other comrades, I'm not sure if you've read the whole book of Permanent Revolution. We did it back in Western Australia. We just did it off our own hat on one stage there. And anyway, we had a look at it and we criticised the hell of it, because basically it was, well, okay, you've done this, but look, you're going to have to put everything to a side because we're going to have to wait till the Western powers achieve socialism. And then we might think about moving ahead. It was basically a form of, we actually comically called it permanent procrastination, because that's what it was. And I can understand too why the people would get sick of something like that, especially in Russia. The material conditions even after the revolution, but around that after World War I, after that horrid civil war, that war of intervention, it was ravaged. That's why there was a form of authoritarianism, but there had to be some form of stability. One, the population had to be fed. They had to be sheltered. The freezing cold Russian winters, and mind you, at that time, what was ravaging around the world, what is happening right now, was the misnamed Spanish flu, which actually came from the trenches of World War I and didn't come from Spain. And I mean that too. It was misnamed. So they had all these things happening, and it's like, right, to alleviate further catastrophe, then we have to get these things in place and straight away. Not because they loved doing it, it's just because that had to be done. Yeah, it was just a critical time. And I think, I take my hats off to the then Soviets and the Soviet government for what they did. It was under extreme conditions. And then they started to work out economic plans, and as we move on. And actually, when we're talking about the economic plans, it looks like it's in the next part, 1.1.9, so I feel like I could take over and read some of the segments out of that. So 1.1.9, Socialist Construction and the Rise of Eurasia. Prior to his death, Lenin explained the goals of the Soviet government this way. There can be no question of rehabilitating the national economy or of communism unless Russia is put on a different and a higher technical basis than which has existed up to now. Communism is Soviet power plus the electrification of the whole country, since industry cannot be developed without electrification. This is a long-term task, which will take at least 10 years to accomplish, provided a great number of technical experts are drawn into the work. The vision was put into practice in 1928, after the defeat of the Trotskyite and Bukharinite opposition and the triumph of Stalin's vision of socialism one country. Stalin's 5-year economic plans completely transformed the Soviet Union into an economic superpower. By 1936, the USSR was the world's top steel manufacturer and had constructed the world's largest hydroelectrical power plant. Excuse me. The Soviet Union had brought running water and electricity to every household. Illiteracy was wiped out among the population. New universities had been constructed across the country, and modern apartment buildings had replaced rural village huts. Interviewed for a 1998 PBS documentary called Red Flag, part of the People's Century documentary series, Tatiana Fedorova, an elderly female construction worker, described her memories of the 5-year plans. We wanted to do something with our own hands to glorify our country, not just with the words but with deeds, and we did it. We built the metro. We built the Magnitogorsk. We built the railway. We did it all with such comradeship, enthusiasm, and happiness. And if today I could live again, despite all the big difficulties, I would have done the same things again. Stalin set the task, build this or build that, and thanks to the fact that people trusted him and this enthusiasm of young people, it was possible. Remember, people were illiterate, lived in virtual darkness, wore birch bark shoes. Even now, I think it's like something out of a fairy tale. It was one of the most difficult times to build this country. To build these great construction sites would only be possible through unity, the unity of the people, and the love of the people to their idol. The secret behind this massive success in economic construction was socialist central planning. The Soviet state had the ability to do so what the chaos of the market could not do, unleash growth. The Soviet Union had eliminated the anarchy of production and the chaos of the market. Thus, they enabled a backward, underdeveloped society to rise to the level of a global superpower. The Stalin era was marked by mobilisations of the population to achieve collective goals towards the overall rebirth of the country. Maurice Dobb was an economics lecturer at the University of Cambridge who summarised with actual numbers the economic progress that was made by socialist planning in the USSR between 1928 and 1938. In his texts, Soviet Economic Development since 1917, Dobb showed that in this single decade, the Soviet Union multiplied its rate of electrification tenfold. During this period, coal production increased by 3.5 times and 20 new tramway systems were built, along with 80 new bus systems. The number of hospital beds in rural areas doubled. By 1938, the Soviet Union had a large tractor production of apparatus than any other country in the world, and also led the world in locomotive production. American radio personality Frazier Hunt, writing for the New York American in 1931, emphasized how dramatic the Soviet Union's explosion of economic growth really was. He said Japan, westernizing and industrializing itself 50 years ago, was doing child's play compared to what the Soviet Union is doing today. Already, almost overnight, the USSR has become an industrial country.
Excellent. One of the great achievements of the Soviet Union's rapid industrialization was the creation of the Dnieper Dam, located in the Ukraine. When this hydroelectric facility was completed in 1932, it was the largest such facility in the entire world at the time. The Soviet government hired technicians from General Election, the American corporation, to oversee the project. Then they mobilized tens of thousands of people to build this massive power plant that brought electricity to the Soviet countryside. In 1941, as Nazi invaders poured into Ukraine, the local residents dynamited the dam so the Nazis could not seize it and use it for their war efforts. The Dnieper Dam was then reconstructed after the war. It must be noted that the economic renaissance created by socialism in Russia and the surrounding republics that made up the Soviet Union took place while the Western world was experiencing the Great Depression. Writing for The Nation in November of 1931, Louis Fischer observed, "The Soviet frontier is like a charmed circle which the world economic crisis cannot cross. While banks crash, while production falls and trade languishes abroad, the Soviet Union continues in an orgy of construction and national development. The scale and speed of its progress are unprecedented. The Soviet Union was a center of scientific and technological innovation. Soviet scientists invented space travel and LED lights. The Soviet Union created the AK-47 rifle, the most efficient weapon ever invented. Their first mobile phone ever created was patented in 1957 by Soviet engineer Leonid Ivanovich Kupryanovich. While Western countries freely adopted Soviet technology, the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls functions and an agreement between 16 NATO countries banning the sale of high technology to the USSR. So what that means is, while the rest of the world was using Soviet technology, NATO and imperialism banned anybody from selling technology to the USSR. The New York Times described the treaty as organized to ensure that strategic technology such as computers, machine tools, and microelectronics items that could be used for weapons and other military applications did not fall into the hands of the Soviet Union. The USSR was prevented from collaborating with Western computer companies and had nowhere near the level of resources to invest in such endeavors. Yet, the Soviet Union actually went as far as manufacturing its own home computer system in 1985, the Electronica BK0010. In the contemporary United States, statements to the effect of the Soviet Union has completely failed or socialism has never worked anywhere are quite common. These statements simply spit in the face of well-documented evidence and do not acknowledge the economic miracles that took place during the golden years of the Soviet Union. From 1917 to 1960, the life expectancy of the Soviet people nearly doubled. Medical care was made widely available in even the most remote parts of the country. The overall living conditions for the population within the Soviet Union improved tremendously due to the Soviet central planning. Despite the shortcomings of Soviet society in terms of human rights and consumer goods, no society has ever raised its technological level and living conditions so rapidly. As the Soviet Union was rapidly industrializing, the world press marveled at what it had accomplished. Among the voices praising the Soviet Union were Albert Einstein, H.G. Wells, the young Nelson Mandela, and British intellectuals Sidney and Beatrice Webb. In his autobiography published in 1969, the well-loved African-American scholar W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, "What I saw in the Soviet Union was more than a triumph in physics. It was the growth of a nation's soul, the confidence of great people in its plan and future. We have begun to recognize the Soviet Socialist Republic as giving its people the best education of any in the world, excelling in science and organizing industry at the highest level." After repudiating the Trotskyist opposition, the Soviet Union very much became a society marching in line with the legacy of city builders throughout human history. When the 1956 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica was published, the entry for Joseph Stalin acknowledged the vast improvements of living conditions, proclaiming he had found Russia working with wooden plows and left it equipped with atomic piles.
Take myself off mute. No, that was actually a very important part, and it's a vital part of history that we have to understand. We're not generally taught this, obviously, in our schools and that. Gee, we wonder why. And before I move on to, I just want a big shout out to Dust James, host for the Working Class Revolt. And also, we need critical thinking. I do apologise. We need critical thinking. I put we need critical thing. So I did make it a public apology. I announced that. But thank you. A big shout out to you too for joining us tonight. And I think actually this was such an inspiration too. I think for a lot of people around the world, which actually flows on to the next part of this Victories for all humanity. And I think it's vitally showed, especially during the 1930s, late 1920s, 1930s, when the rest of what we call the West, or the Western capitalist nations, along with the US, but even for us here in Australia, New Zealand, we're going backward. Poverty just went right through the roof. People were living on the streets. People lost their houses. They were evicted. They were lucky if they got one meal a day, etc. And they were trudging around either in dank conditions or extreme heat, trying to look for work, trying to even just keep that one coin in their pocket and walking around in rags completely. And during those Depression years, it was horrible. It was awful. And my grandparents talking to me about that era, and we can't imagine what it was like for them. Kids had to go bare feet, and your shoes were falling apart, but you had to make ends meet to keep them together. No one could afford anything, and a lot of people actually in Australia were quite malnourished. I remember the recipe they had was dripping and a bit of bread, if you're lucky. And I mean, that's horrible stuff to eat. I actually once I once had actually experiment. Someone cooked it up once, and I thought, I'll give it a try. This is what they would have had, and it was horrible. It really made me sick. It was just, you couldn't know. But this is the thing. This is the thing we have to keep remember what those conditions are. And this was under capitalism, so-called free Western democracy. Well, there you go. There's your free Western democracy for you. Complete starvation and destitution, and do as you're told while you're at it. And if you do get pay, it'll be very low, and you'll be heavily policed as well. There it is. But here in the Soviet Union, they were making huge advances, and they were able to stop the Nazi machine, and they even, as I said, developed space travel and etc. The first computers, the first mobile phone, which surprised me as well. And I never knew that, but until I read up on this stuff as well. So,
Dave, can I just say something there? And I think it's quite important as well. So while the Soviet Union was making these huge advancements in terms of medical and the way that it was looking after the people, and like you were saying there, in the Western world we were going through the Depression. Coming out of that with the struggle of the union movement, but also because of the way that the Soviet Union was showing the way forward for workers around the world, what happened in Australia and New Zealand and other countries around the world was that the governments, the social democratic governments, in particular the Labor governments, adopted a social welfare system so that it looked like capitalism was the friendly system of the workers, that somehow we could thrive as the working class under the leadership of a Labor government and under the leadership of an economic system of capitalism, that we could all be friends together, and that we're all in the same boat, and we can all it means is that the government has to be willing to invest money in its people and so on. That's not the reality. The reality is that it was because of the way that the Soviet Union made these huge gains and was showing the world what was possible under socialism, that some governments had to adopt a social welfare system that would alleviate the threat of revolution or revolutionary uprising by the workers. So that's an important thing that we don't understand in the Western world either.
Yeah. Another thing too, it played a huge role. We had some great leaderships of the unions at times, but even too, it actually influenced the wartime Labor government we had under John Curtin. John Curtin actually wanted to develop Australia and its own independent course, develop our own strong industries, and that because they too lived through the Depression. They saw it and saw what happens. Okay, they were social democratic as such, not Marxist Leninists, but obviously, but they were inspired by that and think, we need to do things ourselves. And really this big nation building exercise. But unfortunately, there's two things. Curtin died in office of a heart attack. I won't get into it. It might have been, I've heard stories, there was a lot of things out in the scene that someone gone. But the other one as well, it was actually Australia was undermined, especially from the end of World War at the end of World War II, but just at the later stage of it, you go by the US, you go on your independent path, we'll do everything in our possible to undermine you all the way. And we'll threaten from since day one to do so. So I won't get into that's a completely whole different chat. We'll be wasting a whole lot of time, but it's certainly, as I said, the Soviet Union was inspirational for many people and for us here in Australia and New Zealand too. Well, this leads on to the next subchapter, 1.1.10, Victories of All Humanity. What I'll do, I'll read the next 2 pages. The advances that the Soviet Union brought to humanity were not merely technological. The socialist state founded by the Bolsheviks spawned the music of Shostakovich and great advances in modern ballet. Yeah, of course it did, as well as the cinematic breakthroughs of Sergei Eisenstein, the father of montage. The New York Times glowed with admiration of the Soviet Union's cultural achievements in 1931, writing, there seems to be no parallel in history to the drive for learning in all branches of knowledge, from reading and writing to the abstruse sciences now in progress in the Soviet Union. Before the revolution, only about 7 million children attended school. Now there are 23 million. The whole school system is growing by leaps and bounds. The teaching is according to the most scientific methods. It is carried on in 70 languages. There have been over 100 peoples going to make up the Soviet Union. And what they meant by 100 peoples, that's nationalities, etc. A system of compulsory schooling has been adopted and everywhere applied. There is a whole deluge of books pouring from the printing presses. The Soviet Union being already the world leader as a publisher of books, not to speak of their superior quality. The theatre, the swiftly growing radio and motion pictures are also tremendous educational instruments. The Soviet Union inserted a very big shift into global consciousness with its condemnation of racial prejudice and discrimination. The Soviet Union, from its inception, rejected the idea that one race is superior to another, something that was widely accepted in most of the world at that time. W.B. Du Bois wrote about how the lack of racial prejudice in the USSR was something he, as a black man from the United States, was deeply impressed with. The Soviet Union seems to be the only European country where people are not more or less taught to look down on some class, group, or race. I know countries where race and colour prejudice show only slight manifestations, but no white country where race and colour prejudice seems so absolutely absent. Internationally, the Soviet Union championed the rights of various marginalised people, most notably African Americans in the United States. The USSR presented William L. Patterson's text, We Charge Genocide, to the United Nations, exposing the horrors of Jim Crow segregation. It was only in the context of the Cold War and constant ridicule in the Soviet press, along with communist-led protests for civil rights at home, that the leaders of the United States moved to adjust issues of racial injustice. Soviet influence pushed the United Nations to begin making statements condemning any form of racial or ethnic supremacy. It is primarily due to the Soviet Union's gigantic efforts on the international arena that in our contemporary world, opposition to racism has become so widespread. The Soviet Union's project of creating a socialist society spread too. China, where Mao Zedong and the Communist Party took power in 1949, Fidel Castro's revolution in Cuba, and Kim Il-sung's revolution on the Korean Peninsula, all resulted in huge advances in living standards. No matter how flawed the socialist societies of the 20th century were, they each abolished illiteracy, creating universal housing and implemented a new level of industrialization. The Atlantis pathology and the economic global order of imperialism would have kept these countries as agrarian, underdeveloped, captive markets. It was socialist planned economies that brought electricity, running water, and industrialization to so much of the planet.
Socialist improvement of basic living conditions for people across the planet included major infrastructure projects. For example, in 1960, the Soviet Union and the Arab socialist Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser together launched the construction of the Aswan Dam. This is the largest hydroelectric facility in the Middle East. When the dam was completed in 1967, the facility brought power to almost every village in Egypt, most of which have never had electricity. The Aswan Dam increased the amount of irrigated land in Egypt by a third and enabled Egypt to produce more of its own food than ever before. Not only did the dam greatly increase agricultural output, but it also shielded Egypt farms from many of the frequent droughts that plagued the region. In the context of the Cold War, the Western world was forced to relent and tolerate some level of development amongst its allies. Bonapartist regimes in South Korea, Iran, Chile, Argentina, and elsewhere oversaw some basic economic development, hoping to stop the spread of communist revolution in the 1950s and 60s. The words of US President John F. Kennedy, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable," were the sentiments of the time. Anticipating the spread of Marxism-Leninism, the Western bankers loosened their grip and allowed some countries within their own sphere to break the chains of poverty. In 1963, the Kennedy administration worked with the Shah of Iran to implement his white revolution, redistributing land and building railways. As historian Evand Ibrahimanian explained, the white revolution had been designed to preempt a red revolution. In 1968, the United States facilitated Japan lending millions of dollars to South Korea so that the dictator Park Chung-hee could oversee the creation of the POSCO Steel Corporation. With huge amounts of government oversight and state control, the Bonapartist Park regime in South Korea brought in a great deal of foreign investment. The hope of Western leaders was that South Korea would be preventing from joining China and its northern country folk in socialist revolution if a prosperous middle class could be established. The period of 1951 to 1973, labeled as the post-World War II economic expansion by economists, is the longest and largest period of economic growth in all of world history. Never before has humanity experienced so much construction and progress taking place. This period of uninterrupted growth across the planet involved construction and central planning in the Soviet Union and other socialist countries. It also included Bonapartist state-sponsored development in Asia and many developing countries, capitalist countries, along with the height of Keynesian welfare states and social democracy in Europe. The notions that socialism does not work or socialism makes people poor, commonly stated in US media and discourse, are simply laughable when observing the actual economic data. Socialism triumph in the USSR and expansion into China and Eastern Europe ultimately resulted in the greatest overall episode of human progress and advancement ever achieved. It should be noted that the global post-war boom ended with the collapse of the Bretton Woods financial system in 1971 and the subsequent oil crisis of 1973. These setbacks had halted a massive wave of growth came from the capitalist world, not from some inherent flaw in socialism. The results of Lenin's conspiracy and exile to seize control of the homeland with a party of a new type was massive. Many great strides forward for humanity were taken as a result of socialism being put into practice, regardless of the widely heralded shortcomings and setbacks. Very good.
Yeah, and it's certainly a lot to cover. I mean, it's amazing that that history. That, yeah, as I said, it's never generally taught to us, but I think this book puts things in a little bit better perspective here. Well, next part, what we do is just go through the questions, going back for the last three chapters we've done of the Party New Type, Socialist Construction, the Rise of Eurasia, and the Victories of All Humanity. So questions that goes through here, does democratic centralism work for the American context? Why not? Why have socialist revolutions only happen in developing countries? Well, what we'll do, actually, I suppose we'll answer it one at a time. Does democratic centralism work for the American context? Well, actually, for the Australian context, for that matter, why and why not? And I don't think. Look, I think we've got to actually understand what democratic centralism is. It's everyone participates at all levels, and then when the majority of decisions made, that and then that decision's carried out. And obviously through things to make. It's not just with it's not a top-down thing or with an executive making all the decisions and then just the majority adopting it. That's not That's not democratic centralism. And for us here in Australia, we don't, for us to understand, yet knowing full well in our context, I think everyone would like to have participate in all levels there and be in all levels of the decision making, not just, all right, we made a decision, then it goes to a small little group of people and they'll determine which is the best way forward. It doesn't work that way at all. It's obviously, this works out for the higher level. But obviously, from a lower to higher level of organisation, it's actually got to be connected to everyday struggles, everyday needs of people. So it can work, but I think it's made to be, for us in Australia, I think we want to put some things in place so it's not abused, so you don't have someone or some group of people just taking absolute power away from everybody else. I think that's sometimes a bit of a general fear, but anyway, over to you.
The only thing, Caleb didn't actually mention much of this in the book, what democratic centralism is, but the one reference that I think that this might be talking about is that whole concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that's a very, very key thing to understand, because how often does the Western media talk about communist countries or socialist countries being dictatorships? And they always pin that label on revolutionary movements around the world. And to some extent it's true. There is a dictatorship of the proletariat, but it should actually be the dictatorship by the proletariat. In other words, the proletariat, the working class, has taken control of that country, and they are now the dictators. Whereas what we live in is a dictatorship of the capitalists. We live in a society that is still a dictatorship, but it's dictated to or by the capitalist ruling class. So democratic centralism is a form of democracy that would only come into place by the dictatorship of the proletariat, or by the proletariat, or by the workers. Under capitalism, we have a bourgeois system, or we have a democratic, so-called democratic system, where every 4 years we go out and we've got the option to elect our leaders. But that's a democratic system that is particular to the dictatorship of the ruling class, the rich ruling class, the capitalist class. That's their model of democracy. Workers have a different model of democracy, and I think that's what this is talking about. And how that might transpire from now on might be completely different, because the revolutionary movement throughout the world is evolving. It's evolving all of the time, and it's evolving with the people. It's not evolving separate from the people. So it may be slightly different from what occurred in the Soviet Union. It might be different from what occurred in China, but it will have some of its grassroots democracy will be similar, because it is represented by the dictatorship of the working class. I just have to leave for 1 sec.
Yeah, that's all right. I'll continue on. Just actually for the audience there, Luke actually made a very interesting point there. We live in a parliament and a very different civil society. Yeah, you're absolutely right there. And also you made actually an interesting point about, I don't think Australia has a very different norms to Tsarist Russia. Well, absolutely right. I mean, with different material conditions, different circles, different historical roots, a whole lot. And I think actually too, when we do use the term dictatorship, I mean, that was actually an interpretation of when Karl Marx wrote Dictatorship of the Proletariat. I don't think he actually meant like top down, because every time we use the term dictator, it has different meaning, different connotations, a whole lot. I think what basically means the rule of the working class. So I know at the moment we're under the rule of the capitalist class. We get to elect a government every 3 to 4 years, and they're the ones who administer and put laws in on behalf of that particular class, which is the capitalist class. They're there to maintain profit. They make sure the profit system keeps going. And so all sorts of laws and bylaws and agreements, etc. It's there to not just maintain profit, but to try and maximise it further. That's what they do. If it was a working class that cheap power here, and it's the rule of the working class, well, then we'd have policies put in place and bylaws, etc., will benefit the majority of the people. And we're able to actually achieve many things. I think actually part of the mistake I should have mentioned, and I do apologise to everyone, democratic centralism. Well, under Lenin's time, it had to be structured in a particular way. You understand that Tsarist Russia was a very oppressive country. It was scary, if you could say. So they had to operate in a particular way. They said they had to operate sometimes in secret, obviously for very obvious reasons. If they came out just openly, publicly, they could have been all rounded up and shot. Pardon me. That was the scenario. How we go about here in Australia, well, that's got to be something that's got to be figured out by ourselves. It depends on where the level of struggle is at any particular time. Apologise about that. Just came from out of nowhere. Chest. Anyway, so that's where it is, and how that's going to look like in Australia. Well, it's going to have our own unique feature to it as well. And I think I don't mean this in a derogatory way to the previous comrades of the past and stuff. I understand that many communist parties that were formed in the 1920s adopted the Soviet model for everything and that's what they said. Well, this is how it is. This is how it works. We basically, here's a blueprint. We just go bang, apply it to here. And just like, well, this is how it's got to work. Instead of actually looking at the conditions we're working on, where the levels of development of capitalism, etc., was in the respective countries and how we go forward. I think actually Chairman Mao and among the Chinese communists, they basically broke away from that mould and said, no, this is how it's got to work for here, and they worked that out. But for us here in Australia, it does democracy work for in the Australian context. Why not? So obviously, in the form that we currently know it as, probably not. It might have to change. It might have to be adaptable as well. So it depends on where the level of struggle is. And the next, I don't know if you wanted to add anything more to that one.
No, but I think that if we jump now to, because I think we tackled the next question, which is why have socialist revolutions only happened in developing countries so far? I think we kind of touched on that a wee bit earlier. But I think I'd like to go straight to this question about, are Soviets or workers' councils a good way of organising neighbourhoods? If so, how do we build them?
Yeah.
We had a bit of a discussion just a couple of nights ago with some people, and part of the thing for Australia and New Zealand is that because we have a welfare state, it's actually I think organising Soviets and workers' councils will actually be quite difficult because of the way we have such a good welfare system. I mean, that's been degraded now very quickly, but we still have, in our minds, we still have the idea that we're going to be looked after by our government. So I think to some extent that's holding workers back in Australia and New Zealand, that the welfare state. And quite often what happens in Australia and New Zealand is that we become, on the left, we become sort of demanding that the government give us more social welfare. And that's an okay, in a sense, that's an okay thing, because of course we should be looked after, but at the same time we're then reduced to being beggars to ask for improvements in the capitalist system, and that's not really very revolutionary. That's not really making demands that says we are the creators of wealth and we should have the large proportion of the wealth distributed amongst us, the poor, the working class. Those that generate the wealth should have the wealth. But while we have this social welfare system that we've got in Australia and New Zealand, I think we're a little bit kind of inhibited to form Soviets and workers' councils. But having said that, I think that if once our social welfare system is so eroded and so degraded, maybe then we'll have to build these new community networks and so on. And I think that'd be a fantastic thing. I don't think you can begin a socialist movement without having those grassroots movements at its very core. And I think that's something that we need to really work on in Australia and New Zealand.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I read the book, The History of the CPSUB, the Communist Party of Soviet Union Bolshevik, 1938 edition. And when they actually talk about the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, the formation of Soviets or workers' councils, that was actually that they came together as a grassroots movement then, but out of necessity as well. And it was a particular material conditions. How will those type of organisations look like here in Australia? Well, one, we wouldn't call them a Soviet. That's typically a very Russian name to use, but will obviously be some form of assembly. Well, I know we talked about this last year during the height of the first lockdowns now about community assemblies and community organisation. And I thought that was something actually not bad. I know that a few comrades on these social media, on these YouTube lives, have actually mentioned that at times, indicated about forming our own neighbourhood assemblies or that and organised from the ground up. How would they look? I think that'd be actually organised out of necessity, not just out of, oh, there's a fantastic idea, let's go and do it. Well, no, it didn't happen. Well, yes, it was a fantastic idea, but it's because it was handled out of necessity at the time. And some of these organisations came together not out of necessity to change the system from imperialism to socialism. It was mainly there to try and, first of all, provide security and that for immediate neighbourhood. Like, how are we going to develop it? Okay, food's expensive, we may have to grow our own food. Okay, you do this and coordinate. It's a form of basically grassroots governing, and that's how it is. So how do we build them here? Well, that's going to be the tough question. I think it's this dependence on someone else to do something. I think that's we're going to have to learn how. Well, we need to actually take back control of our own affairs. How that's going to be happen? Well, I haven't got the answer to that today. I mean, that's got to come from the collective of people to come up with that answer moving forward.
Yeah, and because we've got a highly developed, although there's not much participation, but anymore, but we've got a highly developed union system, and I think it may come out of that movement as well, out of our unions as well. And that's a little bit. All of that is a little bit different from America as well, which is got a whole different system. I wouldn't be surprised if when we talked about earlier. Well, this question here of why socialist revolutions have only happened in developing countries so far, probably because of the necessity to have that revolutionary change. That's necessity is the mother of all invention, and so when you need to change things, then you change them. I would say that considering the state and the conditions of the American working class and the poverty that's existing in America. I mean, apart from its extremely wealthy sectors, it's got these extremely poor sectors as well, which is, the poor sections are becoming more and more expanded, and quite possibly, you could almost put some sectors of, well, quite a large sector of the American working class in the position of calling it a developing nation almost. The poverty level in America is horrendous.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see some kind of massive revolutionary movement in America over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and things are changing very.
Yeah.
I mean,
So just looking at the time, Dave, it's now kind of 8:40.
Well, we might just race through these questions a little bit. You got socialist construction, the rise of Eurasia. I think actually one thing is I like this first one. How do we combat the myth that socialism has failed everywhere it's been tried? Well, it is a myth. I mean, basically, what we've been reading through there, the achievements of the USSR was just never been done before. Building the NEPA plant, dealing with hydroelectricity, electrifying the whole countryside, raising the literacy. I mean, the literacy rate in non-Soviet people was the highest standard in the world. Even their health system was one of the highest. They had huge industry. They were able to defeat and turn the Nazi machine and turn World War II around. Developed space travel, basically, and one of the first people into space, obviously developing the mobile phone, the computer, and some of the advancements, even right through to its deliberate dismantling. Some people say it collapsed. It didn't. It was deliberately dismantled and undermined. It was under attack since day one, both internally and externally, and they played on that as well. But you look at China. It's now superseded the US. People say it's still about to, it's already has superseded the US. Hey, people, China's raced ahead. US, tough luck. You're gone. Along with Australia and everything else. It's now China's head with this Belt Road, One Belt, One Road initiative, and a lot of developing countries jumping on board of that. They've able to lift 800 million people out of immediate, in their own country, of immediate poverty. I mean, do you hear that happening here in Australia? Well, we've just lifted all these people out of poverty. No, we don't. We seem to be driving people into poverty here. When they're developing even further with technology, etc. I mean, Huawei phone is actually one of the best in the world. It's probably the best. I've actually got one. I did that. I bought it out right in the face of what the federal government and what the American government trying to say about Huawei. It's actually a fantastic phone. And did you know that Huawei phone is actually worker owned as well? It's not into one individual private capitalist. It's actually worker owned, and it's in league with the develop along with the Chinese government, develop its technologies further. I mean, it is, say, in Cuba. I mean, it's one of the best health systems in the world. They're actually able to treat cancer and cure the thing. People have actually gone to Cuba to be treated. There's been people in America have actually got to go to Cuba. They've had to go via other avenues to get some basic treatment, but even for cancers, the whole poor people that open up. And Cuba sends doctors and nurses all around the world to help them further. I mean, they do some amazing achievement there. And look at Venezuela now. They'll be on there. They're through serious struggles, but they're going to be turning things around. And also, Peru's coming out onto the board, Ecuador as well. I mean, many other countries, Nicaragua, exactly all these countries. Vietnam, population of 94 million. Guess how many COVID cases they had? So far, I think it's just about lucky we have 1,000 there. They actually got on top of it. So, I mean, when they say socialism doesn't work, yes, it can work. Is there going to be difficulties? Yes, of course there is. It's not going to be. It's not just add water and hey presto. It's going to. These achievements can be done, but we cannot achieve these things under the current system anymore because capitalism, imperialism hinders growth. Socialism unleashes it.
I think that's a great note to finish on, Dave.
Yep. And look, once again, I'd like to thank you to all the listeners tonight for jumping on board tonight. And once again, big shout out to Dust James as well. We will be back resuming this weekend, 10 o'clock Australian Eastern Standard Time for Working Class Revolt. So please be involved with that. And also thank you for everyone else for participating in tonight's discussion. I'm sorry I couldn't address some of the questions there or issues you've raised, but look, at the end of the day, we are limited with time, and because we started half an hour late tonight, we wanted to sort of end it there. So, look, I'm just going to say, look, thank you very much once again, and we'll raise it up that workers of all countries unite.
Signing out.
Signing out, people.